Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. David Shyovitz, who again will talk to us about Till Death Do Us Part, family life, and the afterlife in Jewish and Christian thought. Dr. Shyovitz is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University, and he is also the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. His research focuses on medieval European intellectual and cultural history, with a particular emphasis on Jewish history and Jewish-Christian relations. I would love to hear afterwards, if I could, about his current book project, which sounds really interesting to me, O Beastly Jew, Jews, Animals, and Jewish Animals in the Middle Ages, exploring the overlapping way in which Jewish and Christian authors and artists distinguished humans from animals and Jews from Christians over the course of the Middle Ages. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania and currently resides in Evanston with his wife and family. David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I'm just going to share my screen with everyone so we can look at some slides together. Just give me 1 second. Okay, well, I hope you can all see, there we go. I hope you can all see the slides on your screen. Thank you so much for having me. It's my second time with your congregation, and I enjoyed so much the first time, the conversation and getting to meet everyone. And so although we're virtual today, it's still a pleasure to have the opportunity to learn together. And I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit about a topic that at first glance I suspect is going to seem quite obscure. And it's my hope that we can move past the obscurity and into some real deep sort of reflection about questions and issues that many of us tend to take for granted. Let me start by just briefly introducing how I'm approaching the topic. So as Nancy said, I'm a historian of the Middle Ages, of Jewish and Christian theology in the Middle Ages in particular. And the theological writings of the Middle Ages really tend to get a pretty bad rap, I would say, by people who don't teach them for a living. Ever since the Renaissance, there's been this kind of invented, stereotype of medieval thought that sort of is encapsulated in the question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? You might have heard that phrase before. It's kind of the stereotypical description of what people were spending their time thinking about, how they were occupying their intellectual efforts during this long, so-called dark ages. So thinking about these obscure, highly technical, and ultimately nonsensical sorts of debates and disputes that are rooted in a worldview that probably many of us no longer take for granted, right? I assume many of us don't stay up at night losing sleep over, there's lots of stuff to lose sleep about today, but how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is probably not one of the questions that really gets us excited. And although that question, that sort of stereotype is exaggerated in a way, there is still a grain of truth to it, I would say. Medieval religious scholars did take religion very, very seriously. They took metaphysical and theological assumptions very seriously. And they spent a lot of their time and effort and intellectual activity reflecting on those kinds of issues. I'd like for us today to begin with one such very obscure theological question, right? It's a question that on its face will probably seem to belong to the same class as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But what I'd like to suggest is that if we move beyond, or if we peel back the technical discussion, if we peel back some of the assumptions that maybe we no longer resonate for us, we can nonetheless find there in medieval thought a deep and profound engagement with some of the existential and sort of very profound questions that we continue to grapple with today. And they have to do with family. What is a family? What's the significance of family? Socially, but also maybe metaphysically. So to introduce the discussion from one particular vantage point, I'll point you to a 15th century collection of Hebrew writings called Trumat Hadeshen. This is a text from the 15th century from present-day Austria. It was written by Rabbi Israel Isserlein, who was a very influential and very well-known in his day legal scholar, a Jewish legal scholar. He lived in the Austrian town of Wiener Neustadt. And he was, due to his reputation for sanctity and for sort of brilliance, he was somebody who you would write to if you had doubts, if you had questions about Jewish law, about Jewish theology. He answered hundreds, if not thousands, of questions, and those letters survive today and are collected in this collection, Trumat Hadesh. So you can sort of read the correspondence, the collected correspondence of a particularly influential 15th century rabbi, but somebody who, of course, today to the average person is completely unknown. And as I was going through this collection of sources, one question jumped out at me as sort of the ultimate obscure and seemingly irrelevant medieval, medieval concern. But as you'll see, it's one that I think there's a lot more to. And I've given you a little just a visual of what it looks like on the Hebrew page. The question that was addressed to Rabbi Israel Isserlein by one of his correspondents goes as follows: the wife of Elijah the prophet, can she marry another husband? Now, if you know your scripture, this question may already be ringing bells for you. If you don't, it probably seems like a nonsensical query to be asking somebody. Elijah the prophet, in the book of 2 Kings in the Hebrew Bible, is one of the most important, one of the best known, one of the sort of most illustrious prophets who connects the Israelites with God, who speaks on God's behalf, who performs miracles, who foretells the future. And famously, he is assumed into heaven in a fiery chariot, rather than dying in the normal way that most people die. He doesn't obviously lose his life. Instead, he is physically taken up by God, where, according to later traditions, he sits with God at God's hand and sort of is involved in the day-to-day running of the heavenly court. What happens, Rabbi Isserlein's correspondent wanted to know, when somebody who is alive goes up to heaven, never dies, what happens to their relationship with their wife? Is their wife still married to them? Is Elijah and his wife, although they're now living in different realms, right, one on heaven and one on earth, does the bond of marriage still endure? Or does death sort of sever their bonds? Or in this case, going up to heaven in a heavenly chain, a fiery chariot, does that sever their bonds in some way where the wife of Elijah would be allowed to remarry another husband? Pretty technical question. He goes on to say that this question is not merely of obscure sort of, theoretical interest, but it has practical ramifications for the future. Let's say somebody else merits the same fate as them. Let's say that I'm walking down the street one day and I'm taken up by God in a fiery chariot into heaven. Is my wife allowed to remarry? What happens to the family bond that I've had with her? He goes on to explain, by drawing on a wide array of prior Jewish sources, that when somebody's body changes in a fundamental way, although they don't die in the normal sense, that puts an end to their family relationship. So if he uses as an example the wife of Lot from the book of Genesis, who I'm sure we all know, many of us know from the book of Genesis. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by God. Lot and his family are spared, and they're fleeing. And Lot's wife turns her head, looks back, and is turned into a pillar of salt. And this is an image here from a Hebrew manuscript of her in her statutory form. The Talmud had already said that, and this is a collection of Jewish legal traditions from late antiquity, had famously said that Lot's wife, although she no longer exists in the same sort of state that a regular human does, she, for various ritual purposes, is not considered to have died, right? She's considered to be of a fundamentally different status, and therefore all sorts of laws that we might normally apply to a dead body don't apply to her. So this is one of the texts that is brought into this discussion. There's a number of others as well, where in a very, very lengthy response, Rabbi Israel Isserlein weighs all of these different precedents before eventually coming to the conclusion that when the Torah says, when the Bible says that somebody who is married cannot marry another, right, that adultery is forbidden, and that if you're married to someone and you have a sexual relationship outside of marriage, that is a sin, that refers to the wife of your fellow. You cannot sleep with, right? You cannot have a relationship with the wife of your fellow. That's adultery. But it doesn't apply to the wife of an angel who's completely spiritual and not physical. And Elijah the prophet, when he's assumed into heaven, the assumption is, becomes an angel, is no longer a person. The bonds of marriage have been severed. Now, this question, as I said at the outset, might seem to us to be of very little practical relevant import, right? We probably don't assume, as Rabbi Israel Isserlein did, that there are practical ramifications here, because any one of us might at any given moment be swooped up into heaven in a fiery chariot. And yet, by the time this question in the 15th century was being addressed, the rabbi and his correspondent were the heirs to a long tradition in the Jewish realm, but also by extension in the Christian realm, of theological speculation about family, about the theology of family. And the core question that's being addressed in this responsum, in this letter, is essentially about the theological status of family bonds. When you marry someone, when you have children, do those relationships reflect a social reality, a social construct that governs the way that we might live today, but has no enduring ontological significance? Or when you marry someone, when you have children, when you have a blood or a familial relationship with someone, does that in a way endure beyond your death? Will you still be married in heaven, if you believe in heaven, as we'll see many of our authors who we'll be talking about today did? Are the family relationships just a way of structuring the social order, or does it change you in a fundamental way on a level that maybe goes beyond your physical makeup and translates into your soul? These are questions that from scriptural times, in some sense up until the present, have continued to exercise the imagination of religious thinkers and of non-religious people as well. I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm going to skip over here a little bit in the interest of time. Here's an image from a contemporary evangelical treatment of this question. Will I see my family members again in heaven? And you can see from the depiction here, from the illustration, that it's clearly assumed to be the case. If you lost a baby, or I guess if a baby lost his or her parent, you'll be reunited in the afterlife. Parents and their children, spouses, all of them are waiting to see one another once again, to reunite, to sort of reconsecrate their familial bonds, not just in this world, but in the next world. Or here's another image. I love this one because it also has pets apparently figure into this as well, right? If your dog died, maybe you'll see your dog also in heaven. All dogs go to heaven, according to a famous Disney movie. And of course, the fact that Jesus is in the center here, presiding over this extended familial reunion, gives us a very clear sense of the religious stakes, that religiosity promises, this is a catch line that was very famous in the 80s and 90s, that the family that prays together stays together. That religion unites your family not just in this world, but on a fundamental level in the next world as well. Now, beyond the sort of contemporary theological questions about, is Jesus really going to be waiting for any of us in a grassy meadow, once we pass away, to reunite us with our long lost dogs? So that's a question that I can't weigh in on. I have no way of knowing. I can say, however, that there's even today quite a bit of pushback to this particular image of domestic life and its religious manifestations. So, for example, what does this kind of an image do for people who've had more than one spouse? What if a person is divorced from their husband or wife, or their husband or wife passes away and they remarry? Who are they going to be reunited with in the next world? Which of those familial relationships has this enduring nature to it? What about non-quote-unquote traditional families, non-heteronormative families, step families, adopted families? How do they factor into this particular religious worldview? And then beyond that, so to quote one of my, there's a comedian who some of you may have heard of, Louis C.K. He was in the news recently, and I would not quote him in any kind of admiring way, but he has a very long routine that was famous a few years ago and that articulated some of these questions, where he imagined what happens to somebody who passes away, and then 10 or 15 or 20 years later, their former wife or husband passes away, and now they have to reunite in heaven after decades apart. In his particular telling, the husband who had died now has a new girlfriend in heaven. He's on his way to a party. He finds out that his wife has passed away and they're about to be reunited. And the tagline here is that the angel says to him, "She's the love of your life." And the man in heaven says, "Fine, but she's not the love of my death, right? I've moved on. I've severed my connection." Now, whether we take that as a serious commentary on social norms or not, it's clearly an illustration of some of the tensions today, and as we'll see back then, that people brought to bear in thinking about what kinds of bonds of family life are going to endure, and what that tells us about how we can understand family in our own circumstances. Now, if we look way back to sort of the origins of this debate in the New Testament, we can see that for Christians, there's a long and deep assumption, a tradition, that family takes place in this world and that family ends the moment you die. You simply are no longer connected in any way to any member of your family once you take your last breath. And the sort of classic proof text for this comes from the Gospel of Mark in chapter 12, where a group of Sadducees, a group of Jews, approach Jesus and ask him kind of a thought experiment. They say to him, you're telling us, Jesus, that we're all going to come back from the dead at some point, that God is going to resurrect us, that we're going to have eternal life in God. Well, what about a person who marries a woman, a man who marries a wife, the husband passes away, and the wife then marries another person, and then this happens over and over again 7 times. The technical details here are not really relevant for our purposes. Let's say a woman has 7 husbands over the course of her lifetime. In the resurrection, as we see in the bold here, whose wife will she be? And Jesus says to them, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Jesus says quite explicitly that angels in heaven are not married. They have no familial connections. Their bonds from this world are abrogated once they move to the next world. This image here of people in heaven, or here in heaven, where they're overtly sort of being depicted as angelic and reuniting with their families, this is a explicit contradiction with the text of the Gospels, where we are led to understand that angels are not people, and their familial connections do not endure. In the Gospel of Luke, this is put even more overtly. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Jesus tells his 12 apostles that if they want to be related to God, if they want to have a spiritual life, it involves bringing to an end and, in fact, hating the relationships that they had had with family members previously. As we move forward in time, this particular viewpoint deepens. And as was the case in Mark, it becomes a flashpoint for disputes between Christians and Jews. So this is a brief passage from Origen, who's a 2nd century theologian, very influential Christian theologian from Alexandria, who says that there are some who, while believing in Christ, understand divine scripture in a sort of Jewish sense. Right? So there are some Christians who, unfortunately, are a little too Jewish in their way of thinking. They refuse the labor of thinking, and they adopt a superficial view of the letter of the law. So clearly, he doesn't think very highly of Jewish ways of thinking. And the way that they reflect that is that they say that after the resurrection, there will be marriages and the begetting of children. When people are resurrected from the dead at the end of day, when they go to heaven, when they have some sort of an afterlife beyond their current life. So these Jewish type of thinkers think that family is going to endure. And Origen is here to tell us that that is a way of refusing the labor of thinking, and it's a superficial view of the letter of the law. Any well-rounded Christian would clearly take for granted that your family connection is going to end. The most extreme articulation of this, and there's a lot more that can be said, but we're short for time, so I'll give you just one medieval example, comes from a female mystic, a woman named Angela of Foligno, who was representative of a particular mystical school in the Middle Ages that sometimes is known as sort of bride of Christ mysticism. The idea that women can sort of give up on their family connections in this world and become married only to God. They can become the brides of Christ. And she tells her readers, she writes an autobiography or dictates an autobiography and says, I was inspired by the thought that if I wanted to go to the cross, I should strip myself of attachments to friends and relatives. And at this time, it happened that my mother, who was a great impediment for me, died. Children were dead. And since I'd embarked on the aforesaid path and prayed to God that they would die, I felt great consolation at their deaths. And I thought from then on, after God had done these things for me, my heart would always be within God's heart, and God's heart always within mine. Now, this line, I prayed to God that they would die so that I could be a truly spiritual person, I assume strikes many of us as quite repellent, repugnant, really off-putting. The idea that to be a spiritual person, you not only need to do away with your family connections, but actually to pray to God to get rid of them. So it seems like a sense of misplaced priorities. And yet it's quite characteristic of a mainstream orientation within Christianity, not in those pictures that we saw before, but for much of the history of Christianity. that sees your connection with God as ultimately transcending and superseding and making irrelevant your connection with anybody else, including and maybe even especially your family members. Now, as I'm sure we all know, for much of its history, Catholicism and some other branches of Christianity thought very little of marriage, of sexuality. To this day, right, Catholic priests are not allowed to marry or to have sexual relationships. And that sort of is a view of celibacy that maybe looks down on sexuality and on familial connections, at least for some at the top. The Jewish tradition, at first glance, seems to take a polar opposite view. There is no notion of celibacy in traditional Judaism over the course of its thousands of years of history. And in fact, many classical canonical Jewish texts say that the person you'll be married to, the relationship between a person and their children, is all not only theologically significant, but in fact, heavenly preordained. The Talmud, which we referred to before, this is a collection of sort of legal and moralistic and theological teachings from late antiquity. So the Talmud in Tractate Sota says that in fact, the marriage of a certain person to another person is announced by a heavenly voice 40 days before that person is even conceived, right? By the time you are conceived and the time you're born, you're already connected on a heavenly level with your spouse, right? That is a sort of a deep familial bond that predates your life on earth and postdates, right? Endures after your life on earth. There's many other sources that indicate the same. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, however, texts like that one, a heavenly voice calls out 40 days before you're born who you're going to be married to. So they're not enough for an increasingly rationalistic set of thinkers, of theologians, who want to take sort of Jewish doctrine and Jewish tradition and analyze it from a much more rationalistic perspective. And an example of this line of thinking is a Babylonian, I should say a Baghdadi maybe, Jewish thinker, Saadia Gaon. Saadia is the most important Jewish theologian of early medieval Baghdad. Baghdad was a major center of Jewish life, and Saadia writes a whole series of very influential and lengthy and sophisticated philosophical texts in which he tries to reconcile rationality with these inherited traditions. And that involves asking some of those kinds of questions I alluded to at the outset, seemingly obscure questions that try to apply critical thinking and rational thought to maybe non-rational theological concepts. And so he asks explicitly, in the case in which those to be resurrected were married while they were in this world, will each man's wife return to him because of the fact that she had formerly lived with him? Or does death dissolve all marital ties? What happens to your marital bond once you're resurrected from the dead, once you go to heaven in the next world? And Saadia essentially says that I'm writing a philosophical, a rational treatise, and this is a question that is fundamentally not amenable to rational speculation. Our minds are capable only of grasping our present state. He says, I simply can't come up with a definitive answer to a question that is so far beyond my own experience. He says something cute, which is that when people are resurrected from the dead at the end of days, presumably Moses, the lawgiver, will be resurrected too. And so we don't really need to worry about this question now because we'll just ask Moses in the end times, right? Luckily, when we all come back from the dead and we have these questions about are we still married or not, we'll just ask the greatest of Jewish teachers and he'll be there to guide us, right? However, and here's an image of that text from a medieval manuscript. Interestingly, just as a side note, Saadia lives in Baghdad, and what we see here in the manuscript image is his original writing, or an original version of his writing of this treatise, this philosophical treatise, which he writes not in Hebrew but in Arabic. The theological language, the learned language of the time for Jews and for Muslims and for many Christians was Arabic and not for Jews, not Hebrew, which is a little known but very, very interesting to me sort of data point as we think about the history of Jewish-Muslim relations and of Christian-Muslim relations, is that much of the sort of theological innovations of the time were actually being written not in Latin or in Hebrew, but in Arabic. Side note there. As we move forward in time, so other influential Jewish texts took for granted that although Saadia had been unsure about what's going to happen to family bonds in the next world, it was simply inconceivable, given the long and deep tradition of sort of positive thinking about family life in the Jewish tradition, it was inconceivable that people would not continue to be married to one another, to have relations with one another after their bodies pass away. So this is a text from the Zohar. The Zohar is a book translates as the Book of Splendor. It's a 13th century Jewish mystical treatise, Kabbalah, which is a Jewish mystical school of thought, has all kinds of ramifications throughout history, including today. And in Kabbalistic thinking, in Jewish mystical thinking, the Zohar is the preeminent source. This 13th century text is the preeminent source. And it says quite explicitly that once you are married, or if you have children in this world, you will absolutely see those people again in the next, that your family connection does not end with the death of the body. And that leads to all kinds of, again, very technical questions about, well, if you're married to two people, which one will you reunite with? Is it going to be your first husband or your second husband in this case, right? If a woman is married to two people. And there's a long description, we're not going to go into this in the interest of time, of what it's going to look like at the gates of heaven when one spouse sits there waiting for their spouse to pass away so that they can be reunited. The assumption here is that marriage, family life, having children, doesn't merely affect your social standing, it changes your soul. That there's something literally on a metaphysical level, on a cellular level, we might say, that shifts when you have deep enough and enduring enough familial bonds in this world during your lifetime. Now, that set of assumptions that Christians throughout their history have had a tendency or a trend to denigrate the family, and that Jews throughout their history have had a tradition or a trend to sort of valorize it, is called into question by another set of sources that I want to introduce to complicate matters somewhat. And this is a set of sources, and I'll give you just two examples, by 12th and 13th century theologians who spend a lot of time thinking about this issue of familial bonds, family life, and the afterlife, and who actually come to a very different perspective. So the first of these sources is by a rabbi named Rabbi Moses Taku. Taku is a medieval Hebraicized version, probably of Dachau, which is infamous town now, but was a center of Jewish life in the Middle Ages. And he writes a book in which he interrogates all kinds of Jewish theological concepts, and he says that the righteous, when they are resurrected from the dead, will take wives in accordance with their deeds. For each one will not marry the wife he had in this world, unless the two of them are of equivalent righteousness. Why? Because death severs their bonds. When they're resurrected, each person will marry the partner who is appropriate for them in accordance with their deeds. So if you're married to somebody, a husband to a wife to a husband, right? Obviously, we're in the Middle Ages, we're working within a heteronormative set of assumptions. If you're married to a spouse who is exactly your equal in morals, in ethics, in spirituality, in the goodness of their deeds, so there's a good chance that you'll marry each other again in the next world, because, people in the next world get matched up based on their theological status rather than on, physical attraction or who you happen to meet at a bar one night or however else your family bond might have originated. But absent that exact correspondence between your theological statuses, you will not marry the same person in the next world. Your family life comes to an end with death. Death severs their bonds. A contemporary of Rabbi Moses named Rabbi Elazar ben Judah from the German town of Worms, another important medieval Jewish theologian, says similarly, the dead will be resurrected at the end of times in the days of the Messiah, and they will not be paired with one another unless they're worthy. Death separates. He goes on to say, one righteous man will see his wife be paired with another righteous man and will feel no resentment. Or if we skip down, God will give to whomever he decrees a loving heart to love she who is fitting for him, and she will love and find attractive he who is fitting for her. No man will feel a desire for another woman, nor any woman for another man. Any kind of erotic attraction, attraction that you might have had to your spouse will disappear. Any sense of jealousy that you see the wife you were married to for decades now married to someone else, or the husband who had been your partner who now has gone off to somebody who's more fit for them in terms of their righteousness, any kind of resentment will be mitigated, will disappear. Family bonds, again, to put it in the sort of final and very unequivocal way that Elazar does, death separates. Family is a social construct, and it simply doesn't endure or connect you to anybody on any kind of a more spiritual or theological level. Now, it's quite a surprising view in the Jewish tradition, because as we've seen, so much of the countervailing tendency throughout Jewish history has been to valorize family, not least of all by pushing back against Christianity, right? By saying, you Christians believe in celibacy, you Christians denigrate the family. Jesus himself says that there's no enduring bond between family members in the next world. So Jews for a long time, as we've seen, had tried to push back against that. And yet we see these influential Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages taking a page out of their Christian contemporaries' book and essentially saying that it's true that family members have no enduring connection. Now, if we look a little bit deeper in the same time period, we find a wide array of sources that actually try to double down on this perspective. So remember Elijah the prophet? So the dispute that we saw in the 15th century had to do with whether Elijah's wife would be allowed to remarry. The fact is that Elijah, elsewhere in scripture, is described as sort of the ultimate person who brings families together. There's a verse in Malachi in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible that says that Elijah shall return the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. Elijah, throughout his career in the Bible, helps to salvage family bonds. If you read the second book of Kings, Elijah over and over again goes to people's homes, is called by parents who have lost their children, and he resurrects their children. There's a number of famous stories about Elijah bringing children back to life to reunite them with their family members. Elijah, we might think, is the ultimate exemplar of somebody who shows the significance, the lasting nature of these family bonds. According to the Book of the Pious, a very influential 13th century Jewish text, it's not the case. Elijah in heaven basically separates parents from their children. This is a very evocative image, unfortunately, these days, right? Of parents and children being torn apart, being separated from one another. Why? Because God, if you look at the bottom of the slide, shows no favoritism in the next world. He groups people in accordance with the quality of their deeds. Similar to what we saw a moment ago. You're judged solely based on your righteousness, and any attachment you might have had, emotional attachment, simply disappears. And it's Elijah, of all people, who puts that into practice. We're told also in the same text that one should not love their children until they become God-fearing. For if one loves merely the bodies of his children, this is basically an animal attraction. It's just the way that a dog loves his puppies. Feeling an emotional connection to family members is not a spiritual value. It's a concession to one's animal instincts. There's a whole series of sources that we don't have time to go through in detail now that point to this same kind of viewpoint. One who wants to plumb the depths of piety, to look at the bottom here, can do so only if he's wise and discerning. And how does he show that wisdom? By abandoning the ways of the world, abandoning interactions with other people and the delights of his children, any conversation with his wife. We've come in this viewpoint very close to what we saw at the beginning. Jesus is teaching that the only way that you can become a disciple of God, of Christ, is by hating your parents and your children and your spouse, by totally separating yourself away and looking only at your own spiritual standing, to the exclusion of any familial connections you may have had. Now that's to me at least, quite a depressing viewpoint. It's one that doesn't resonate in the slightest for me, as somebody who is married, as somebody who has children, as somebody who has a network, thankfully, of family members. But what I do want to say is that it teaches me at least two interesting things. And the first is that it pushes back pretty dramatically against the idea that we can distinguish between a quote-unquote Christian view of things and a quote-unquote Jewish view of things. Much apologetic literature written by Christians and by Jews over the course of the last 2,000 years, like Origin, like the Gospels, like the sources we saw at the beginning, have tried to sort of reify or to support Christian identity by saying we Christians believe this, and it's unlike those Jews who believe something else. And Jewish thinkers throughout the ages, as we've also seen, have tried to sort of depict their own community in a positive light by contrasting it with that of their neighboring Christians. Oh, those Christians believe X, Y, and Z. They're into celibacy. They have all these crazy beliefs. We Jews, we know the true meaning of family. We know the true meaning of spirituality. There's a tendency, I think, throughout history for lots of religious communities to draw distinctions between religious communities as a way of bolstering the self-confidence and bolstering the self-esteem of their own. What we see in this case study is that any kind of broad generalizations about we do this and they do that and we do this, are doomed to fail from the get-go, because each of those religious traditions has a diversity of viewpoints throughout history, and sometimes even within the same period of time, that undermines any notion that we can definitively separate us from them. People who have written, including myself, who've written more about views of family in the Middle Ages, can show, I think, pretty clearly that this latter Jewish viewpoint, the idea that family ends at death, that you're only responsible for yourself, that God only cares about your spirituality and not about your family network, it's taken directly from Christian monks and Christian nuns who were preaching that viewpoint within medieval Europe. Jews don't come up with this on their own. They're absorbing it from the Christian culture. And at the same time, as we saw in the earliest sources about origin in the Gospels, Christians are articulating their views in dialogue with, under the influence of, Jewish communities. So the idea that we can even separate between one religious community and another breaks down the deeper we look at some of these seemingly obscure questions. Does it really matter whether Elijah the prophet's wife can remarry or not? Maybe not in and of itself, but when we trace the sort of through line of how we got to that point in terms of Jewish and Christian traditions, we see that there's this sort of braided path, or a tangled path, where Christian and Jewish views intersect and diverge, but are constantly in dialogue with one another. This is point number one. Point number two, and this is a little bit more of a postmodern read, is that I think we might be able to find within these traditions that seem so repellent. You're not going to care about your family in the next world. You're only going to care about yourself. All of your family bonds will come to an end. We may see a way of addressing some of the more sort of repressive understandings of family that have predominated for a long time. As we said in the beginning, what happens to, in the evangelical view that we saw, where you're going to be reunited with your families in heaven? What happens to non-heteronormative families? What happens to adopted families? What happens to abusive families? Do you want to tell a wife who's been abused by her husband, or a husband who's abused, or a father who's abused his children, that don't worry, when you get to heaven, you're all going to be reunited once again with one another, because family endures on a spiritual level? Sort of echoing some of what Nancy was saying at the get-go, there's almost the seeds of a viewpoint here that sees family not as something that you are born into, something that you inherit, but something that you make. That when you get to the next world, you're going to be united not necessarily with the person you spent your life with, but with the people who you want to be spending your afterlife with. That the family can be expanded into a broader category that accounts for your righteousness, that accounts for your values, that accounts for your morality, and that is also as much, or maybe even more, of a meaningful set of relationships than biological ones. So I hope that's not pushing some of this material too far, but I hope that it does give us a sense of some of these very obscure and, again, repellent discussions from the Middle Ages that on the surface seem to have so little to offer to us as modern people. If we push hard enough on them, I think there's quite a bit of existential and philosophical and really profound reflections on core human issues that we might be able to take away from them. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And I hope that we will be reunited, maybe not in heaven, but in person at least sometime in the near future. And I wish all of you good health and happiness in the days and weeks to come.
Sorry, somehow I got muted. I'm not sure how. Thank you, David. I now invite the congregation's questions. I would request that comments and extended questions be reserved until after the service is over in our breakout sessions. If you do have a question, unmute yourself and raise your hand, and either I or Joanne will call on you, and then please mute again after your question. Raise your hand. Oh. Bill, I think I see you. Go ahead.
David, first of all, this is a comment. I took your course at Northwestern spring of 2018 on the early history of Christians and Jews, and I found it fascinating and would have signed up for a later course you were to give, except for the pandemic. My question is, it seems to me that in the world of Jewish culture, religion, most people did believe in the afterlife and things like angels up until a certain period. Maybe it was in pre-rabbinic times. Presently, very few Jewish congregations talk about an afterlife or about a reunion in heaven. Is the breakdown based on how conservative or orthodox or reformed they are, or has there just been a transformation among all the congregations?
Yeah, this is a really wonderful question. Thank you very much. And I'll preface it by saying that when Joanne first reached out to me, it was to talk about the alumni course that I'm going to be teaching in the winter, which is called The History of Heaven. That's the course that was canceled for the pandemic. It has been rescheduled. So anyone who's interested in learning more about heaven and ideas about the afterlife, there's going to be much, much more. And this was sort of a little snippet that was taken from that course. The question you're asking is a really great one, because if you look at canonical Jewish sources, the Bible is pretty vague, but if you look at the Talmud, if you look at later rabbinic writings, really for hundreds of years, it's very clear that an idea of the afterlife that many of us today associate with Catholicism or with Christianity is originally a Jewish notion. A fiery hell where you're going to be punished for your sins, that's in the Jewish sources before it's in Christian sources. Sort of a heavenly realm where you're going to be rewarded for the rest of your life. That's there too. Oh, not the rest of your life, the rest of your afterlife, right? That's there too. Now, there's disputes among Jewish thinkers about exactly how to interpret it. What does it mean that you go to heaven? What's it going to look like? Will you have a body? Will you not? Will you eat and drink? Will you just study Torah all day long? When you go to heaven, to hell, how long will you burn in fire? What kind of fire? So, these are things that get discussed in a lot of detail. But there is no question that it is a core part of Jewish theology for a very long time. And again, the Christian, what we might think of as a stereotypical Christian notion of, heaven and hell is originally a Jewish notion. And like so much that's in early Christianity, it's taken from Judaism, or it's adopted from Judaism. And yet you're right that if you go into your average synagogue today, you will be hard pressed to find anybody preaching about, don't sin or you're going to go to hell and God will punish you, which you can certainly find in other, right, in some Christian settings throughout the world. Why that change is really interesting, and I think much of it has to do with what I was discussing or alluding to maybe in this talk, which is that as Christians become more and more sort of devoted to a particular conception of heaven and hell, so it becomes more and more of a Christian conception, and Jews are that much less likely to invest their time and effort in it. So to give you an example, in Renaissance Italy, I'm sure many of us know the writings of Dante, right? Dante in the Divine Comedy describes what it's going to be like to go to heaven and to go to hell, and which sinners are there and what they're suffering from. There are Jewish writers at the time who are writing exactly the same genre, tours of heaven and of hell. They're doing it in Hebrew rather than in Italian. And it's part of a broad culture where Italian Jews and Christians are writing the same kinds of things. They're thinking about the same kind of theology. But Dante takes off and becomes a part of the canon of Christianity. And the Jewish authors who are writing are mostly neglected, because by that point, it has become a Christian view. And what had originated in Judaism now gets rejected gradually by other Jews because it has become so associated with Christianity. So again, this idea of sort of a tangled or braided set of theological views where Jews and Christians are bouncing off of one another, learning from one another, but also eventually being repelled by one another, tells us, I think, something really interesting about the way that these religions develop in dialogue, but also in dispute with one another over the course of time. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Peg? You're muted, Peg.
Thank you. My question is more procedural, I guess. I was fascinated that our Israel Isserlane, that there are copies of his correspondence that would include both the questions and the answers, and there were no copy machines. So how is all of that recompiled?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's very astute because, as I'm sure we all know, in the 15th century, I mean, Isserline is living just on the cusp of print, right? Gutenberg is going to invent the printing press shortly afterwards, but there are probably hundreds of thousands of sets of questions and answers like his, written over the course of hundreds of years by Jewish rabbis and by community members and people who are in these extended webs of correspondence. To the extent that already in the early Middle Ages, there's a new genre name that is developed for it, right? The genre is called, in Hebrew, it's called She'elot u'tshuvot. It literally means questions and answers, where the sort of legal or theological guidance of influential rabbi is intrinsically sacred in a way, and it needs to be preserved. And the sort of entire sets of correspondence of a certain rabbi are preserved over the course of their life. They're collected and they're recopied, right? Like any other book from before the age of print, if you want a copy of it, you sit and you write it out yourself, or you pay a scribe to write it out for you. And so for rabbis like Israel Isserline, and again, dozens or hundreds of others, there are massive corpuses of their letters that survive from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries and onward. And for historians like me, this is an amazing set of sources, because how often do you get to read the letters of somebody who lived, 1,000 years ago, and not just one letter they wrote to their friend, but dozens or hundreds of letters that they wrote over the course of their life. You can really reconstruct not only their own careers, but you can reconstruct what were the questions that were on people's minds, what were the issues that were troubling people in the Middle Ages or in early modernity, when all of these letters were being written and were being preserved. And so again, the fact that many of these questions focus on, am I going to see my wife in the next world? Am I going to see my children in the next world? Psychologically, it tells us something really moving and interesting about what people were worrying about, what questions people were grappling with during the Middle Ages. But it also gives us a sense of the wide array of different responses that Jewish thinkers, were feeding them. And as we saw, those ranged from, yes, don't worry, you guys are going to be reunited as soon as you die, to, no, don't worry, you'll never have to see that person again, and you'll only hang out with whoever you want to. So thank you.
We have time for one more question before our final song. Pat, go ahead. You're muted again.
So my follow-up to that is, maybe I'm not understanding exactly. Was the copy of the correspondence made before he sent it to far reaches, because these letters were coming from all over the world? Did they make the copy beforehand in order to preserve it, or is it collected afterward and put together?
Yeah, so sorry to clarify, and I should have said this more clearly. I think the way to think about this is sort of as an archive. If you're an influential communal leader and somebody sends you letters, you preserve them, and you preserve either a copy of your own letter that you're sending back in response, or eventually, let's say, in this case, for Israel Isserline, his son is very much involved in preserving his father's correspondence. So if he's writing to another well-known rabbi, then that rabbi is keeping their own archive, right? And eventually these texts are cross-referenced, eventually they're printed. So these manuscripts circulate, but they're based on a collected archive that people are keeping, precisely because these letters are not just letters, they're important legal sources.